The purpose of this series is to gain practical information regarding the specific relevant job skills expected from instrumentalists and vocalists. My intention is to introduce working artists from various genres and provide an opportunity to learn what is generally required and expected from instrumentalist and vocalist in a professional working environment. For those of you watching this, try to look for consistent answers and complaints from each guest artist to arrive at a general consensus regarding your instrument or voice that might improve your job skills. So our guest today is Eric Levan. Eric, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to do this.
It's my pleasure to be here.
How would you classify yourself as a musician?
I'd say that I'm a classical pianist. I play classical music, although I have ventured off into some other domains.
Nice.
Some, I suppose you would call it jazz.
Okay, excellent.
More or less playing some transcriptions of great jazz improvisations.
Sure. Could you tell our viewers about your accomplishments, such as who you've performed with, along with any other notable work, maybe some recording sessions, those kind of things?
Certainly. Well, I'm a performer and I'm also a recording artist. And I suppose that my favorite form of transmitting music is through recording, although I do love performing live as well. But for me, the recording process is something that it's very special to me, because I feel that I can attain the ideal, or at least the ideal that I have at the moment. So I've recorded pretty extensively. Most of the recordings I do are made in Europe, at the Bayerische Rundfunk in Germany, although I've recorded with American companies as well.
Sure.
So I've recorded as a soloist and also as a collaborative musician. But I've recorded as a soloist, for example, the music of Brahms.
Okay.
Several CDs of the solo music of Johannes Brahms. Also, music of Alexander Scriabin, one of my favorite composers.
I love Scriabin. Yeah.
Fascinating. And in fact, there's a new project that's underway. I'll be recording several of the Scriabin sonatas.
Nice.
Third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. That's an all-consuming project. Not only in the amount of time it's requiring of me for preparation, but also the preparation which exists outside of the actual studio. Getting back to recordings, I've recorded the complete Liszt works for cello and piano.
Okay.
As well, and that's on the using Franz Liszt's own piano, which was in Bayreuth.
Oh, wow.
1873.
Outstanding.
And that was a first. So I'm interested in discovering works that have been either by very famous composers, such as Liszt, that have been neglected, or discovering the works of composers who really merit to be better known. I recorded with a wonderful cellist named Guido Schiefen, who's from Germany. And that was a first. We used the piano. They transported the piano for the first time out of Bayreuth,
wow,
where it had been for many years. And Liszt, every time he visited Bayreuth, he played on that piano. It's a unique, not only unique sound, it possesses a unique sound, but also a unique look, because the piano is painted yellow to match the Rococo hall in the Steingraber factory, and there was a special hall built for performances. So it was a Steingraber piano, and very unique look and unique sound. Silvery touch and beautiful for collaborative work.
Beautiful.
If you want, I can continue about the recordings. I've recorded the works of Raff with a violinist, an American violinist based in Switzerland, Michaela Petsch. I recorded a world premiere of his works as well for violin and piano.
Nice. Now you play violin yourself, don't you?
I did study violin. I played it for many years. I had experience within orchestras, which I thought was very formative as far as getting to know the symphonic literature.
Sure.
And I took to that instrument naturally. I I was able to play vibrato before anybody taught me. I was, in a sense, self-taught on the instrument. So I wish
Wow.
I do play from time to time, but at one point, the piano started taking up all of my time as far as practice. And,
Sure.
but yes, that's, and I think that it's very important for pianists or instrumentalists either to play another instrument or to sing, because the most difficult aspect for pianists to achieve is make the instrument sound like something that it's not.
Oh yeah, I guess so, because there's the touch, and I mean,
Yeah, a simple piano sound is never enough. The piano always has to be transformed into something else. So either it's to sound like an orchestra, or it's to mimic the human voice.
sure.
And so when we think in those terms, the piano becomes very interesting.
Yeah, and you probably have to come up with other ways to do that, because obviously there's no vibrato available to you as a pianist, so you have to mimic the voice in other ways, right?
That's right. We have to imagine there's vibrato. We have to imagine that each tone is sustained to the next,
Sure.
and imitating the cantabile sound and phrasing. And
Exactly.
I always return to the pianists of the past who had a deep understanding of cantabile. And when you listen to them, some of the earliest recordings from early 20th century, you can hear in the phrasing. Not
Sure.
only did they imitate, in a sense, the cantabile of the great singers they were used to hearing, but they also were able to phrase in a way which, so through rhythmic inflection, they were able to imitate the human voice and the breathing and what to do in order to make an expressive phrase out of a simple piano phrase. The phrasing not done not only through dynamics but also through rhythm. So,
Exactly.
and in a
Excellent.
sense, that's been a bit lost with modern pianists. That we do phrase through, for example, starting a crescendo piano and shaping it, making a slight crescendo and then decrescendo at the end of the phrase. That's a typical phrase you might do, but oftentimes there was a rhythmical way of phrasing where you would actually accelerate a little bit in the middle of the phrase and then slow down a bit at the end, or taking breathing spaces. There are
Sure.
all kinds of expressive ways we can do that, and that mastery of rhythmic inflection has been a bit neglected or lost in recent years.
Sure. Yeah. Are you now? Would you, as far as the different genres or eras of classical music, would you align yourself more with the Romantic era?
I'd say that I am very attracted to it, but when I play Bach, I think that that's the only music I ever want to play when I'm in,
Yeah.
in the midst of doing it. So I would say 19th century is fascinating, and also early 20th century. For me, the early 20th century, Ravel, Debussy, Scriabin
Exactly.
is one of the most fascinating periods in musical development. Not only
Yeah.
because I think harmonic expressiveness had been pushed to its limit, but also because of the repercussions it had on so much music that was to follow, including jazz, as you well know.
Sure.
Debussy, Ravel, Scriabin in terms of harmony. So I think that the harmonic, um, the expressive power of harmony reached its peak at that period.
Yeah. Debussy. I remember the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, analyzing that, and it's like, oh, here's a dominant 7, 9, sharp 11, 13. This
That's right.
exact same vocabulary that a jazz musician would use for chords.
Isn't that interesting? And I
Yeah.
think to a lesser degree, maybe, but Scriabin's exploration of harmony. But what's interesting in the case of Scriabin is that you never feel that it's an intellectual system imposed on the music. He wasn't interested in systems per se. He only, I would say, organically chose the language that would best be able to communicate what he was trying to communicate and philosophically, aesthetically, spiritually. So getting back to the recording of these pieces, the demands are tremendous because he pushes the limits. I suppose this might sound like immodest, but you want to try to make a recording that hasn't been done yet. Like nobody else is recording it quite in that way. I mean, that's
Sure.
the way you have to approach it.
Well, that's
Otherwise, it's not worth doing.
right, and that's kind of the goal, I think, of most musicians. I would say is some sort of originality, and in your case, the originality of interpretation. But also,
That's right.
also being at the same time being true to what you feel the composer's intentions were.
That's right. And what were those intentions? You know, a lot of times it goes beyond what is. It definitely goes far beyond what is written on the page.
Right.
There's so much more we have to bring to it, so we become co-creators. And I think that that's especially the case with a composer such as Scriabin. But
that's a great way to put it.
You know, one of the points is that you, as a jazz musician, you know about this because improvisation is the most important aspect, and creativity at the moment,
Sure.
most important aspect of music making. But this was also a very important aspect of classical music making as well.
Yeah.
We forget that many of the great composers were great improvisers. Beethoven,
Mozart,
Bach. Yes, most of their music was improvised. You
that's
think
right.
about it, and we know that from letters. When Mozart would write, I played one movement of my sonata, and then I improvised, and then played the second movement.
Right.
So, you know, concerts integrated that aspect, and also, of course, performers were composers.
Exactly.
There weren't really strictly performers, and so they approached performing as a composer would.
Exactly.
Oftentimes. So I think that it's very interesting for an interpreter to try to get back at least to the spirit of what it meant to create and to improvise.
Absolutely. Great comment. Wow. Excellent. How did you originally begin in music?
I think I was something like nearing 5 years old, and there was a neighbor who bought an upright piano for the family, and I saw it, and I was fascinated by the instrument. So I asked my parents to please get a piano for me so that I could start to play. So it was something that wasn't imposed on me. I know that from the start. I really wanted to, but I for some reason when I was a small child, I thought of myself as an artist because I had a room that I shared with my brother, and the brother second oldest to me, and my side of the room was full of easels for painting and anything to do with the artistic endeavors.
I see.
And his side had sports, that type thing. So I asked my parents to let me learn, and then I took it from there.
Were your parents musical themselves?
My father wasn't an educated musician in the sense that he could read music, but he had a very fine baritone voice, and he had great musical instincts, and he was knowledgeable about opera. In fact, he directed quite a few operas.
Wow.
Stage director, and so he could sing, and he could learn a piece quite quickly by having it played to him a few times. So we heard music at home. We heard opera. We heard. I remember listening to the recordings of Fritz Kreisler early on, and I was fascinated by it. So I think that the sensual and the expressive power of music hit me strongly early on. I mean, even very early, because I even remember I was something like 3, and I was doing something. I think I was grabbing for a cookie in the cookie jar and climbing up, and then there was a recording being played, and I just froze. I froze because I found it so beautiful. It hit me viscerally.
Wow.
I felt tingling, physical tingling, and I wanted somehow to be part of that.
How did you begin establishing yourself as a professional rather than as a student or hobbyist? Was it a gradual process? And if so, how did you support yourself in the beginning stages?
That happened when I left for Europe. I had studied music, of course, for many years, and I was actually I studied with a pupil of Alexander Siloti. He was in his 70s, probably nearing 80 at the time, and I was maybe in my I was in my early teens. I started studying with him, and Siloti was a pupil of Franz Liszt. So there was a tradition there. I was fascinated by that, and I wanted, of course, as a young teenager, to play the most difficult repertoire. But I was on my way to mastering the most difficult pieces. When it really started happening is when I left for Europe after my undergraduate studies.
Okay.
I in music. So I left and I ended up in Switzerland. I studied with a wonderful Austrian pianist named Rudolf Buchbinder, who was truly a performer. I mean, he was giving hundreds of concerts a year and had the experience to be able to transmit what it means to be an actual performer.
Okay.
And I was still a student at that time, and then I slowly started giving concerts. It started happening in Europe. I would say the great advantage of Europe is that every small town has a festival. In France, for example, and there's quite a bit of support. I think it's in Germany, for example, there's support for festivals and local concerts. So it was possible to start out small in smaller festivals and work your way up and gain experience rather than being projected onto the most important concert venues. So I started playing more and more, and then by chance I was able to make my first recording, which was quite a risk for the company because I proposed Brahms sonatas, and that was a Swiss company. And the president of the company asked me, "What do you want to record?" I said Brahms. I just threw it out there, and he took a risk, and because I was unknown,
Right.
and Brahms has been recorded hundreds of times.
Sure.
And I did it, and it so happened that it got a lot of attention because it maybe my approach was different, and it got very good reviews. And
Excellent.
then I was able to make my next recording because of that. And then I started recording with Music and Arts, which is an American company, very very well known for bringing out great historical recordings, but also of making recordings of interest, unknown repertoire, composers who are lesser known.
Sure.
And so I started gaining recognition in that way. And then I also started playing with some musicians who were, I felt very artistically drawn to. And I started touring with the cellist I mentioned earlier, and I recorded the Liszt pieces with him. And he was quite well connected in Germany, and so I began performing in the venues that he was accustomed to performing in.
Wow.
And then I could come back as a soloist, not only as a collaborative musician. So in that way, I started playing quite a few concerts.
Is there a recipe for success or a specific way to become a professional musician or vocalist, or are there multiple ways of achieving success? Is going to college important? If so, why?
That's a loaded question, but I would say that personally, I don't believe there's any one way.
Good.
And I think less so now than ever before.
Sure.
Because the music world has changed quite a bit from what it once was. And I would say for a classical musician, we're looking at a different scenario. Admittedly, the concert audiences are diminishing. Performances are fewer. There are fewer recitals than there were before. And I think that one has to adapt. Of course, media is changed as well. So now a lot is online. Recording industry has changed because instead of buying CDs, people are simply uh, downloading.
Correct.
So one has to adapt. I think as personally, I didn't follow the usual trajectory. Uh, I did study, but I felt that the studies were not necessary in order to be able to start performing. All of my performances came as a result not of my diplomas or any of that. It came out of opportunities that arose
Hmm.
in and by the people I met, the musicians who had trust in me and wanted to perform with me.
Sure.
So that's one of them. And the other is that yes, I think like any practical endeavor, having a diploma can be useful if one wants to teach later on. So that's
Correct.
part of a career as well. As for a performer, I don't think so. And I think even competitions are becoming less and less interesting. Maybe they weren't always that important to begin with. Because the problem with competitions is that you're always looking for a performance uh, that will please everybody. And what's artistically interesting is not necessarily the interpretation that's going to please everybody or please the majority. Competition winners are not necessarily the most interesting musicians. So
Sure.
yes, maybe there are still practical reasons why one would want to win a competition, but I think the true artist will always emerge uh, despite competitions. Performers I like to listen to. There's one Croatian pianist, Ivo Pogorelic, who he was rejected from the Chopin competition back in the 80s, and Martha Argerich left the jury in protest. As a result, he became well known. His interpretations are always interesting. You may completely disagree with them, but there's something personal and unique. And for example, his recording of Scriabin's Fourth Piano Sonata it's a revelation and almost superhuman. So
Hmm.
that type of music making is profoundly interesting to me.
How important is persistence and determination in this industry?
I think that's it's everything because one will constantly come up against failure and rejection. And it's part of the process. And those who believe enough in music and have to make music no matter what, even if it means constant rejection. Those are the ones who will stay, and they have to continue music making in any capacity because it's their life,
Sure.
and as opposed to those who want to simply make a career of it.
Right.
And I
Right.
think in the end, those people will come out as being interesting to the public. Those who had enough determination and who had to continue no matter what. It's very discouraging for a lot of people because they don't even understand why they might be rejected for this or this competition or this, and oftentimes there aren't very valid reasons. A true artist will always continue to
Because
make
they have
music
to.
because they have to.
Yeah. It's not even an option, I think. I mean,
It's not an option. Fritz Kreisler, one of my favorite violinists from the past, in the early 20th century, he said, if I were not paid, if nobody wanted to pay me to play, I would still be playing.
sure.
I would still be doing concerts. It doesn't matter. I have to make music. I have
Right.
to express myself in this capacity.
Yeah.
So I think that's the attitude that an artist has to take. Otherwise, one can't survive this because it's a very very difficult field to be in from a practical point of view. For example, Schubert
Sure.
died when he was 31, and most of his music was never published. He earned almost no money from his composition. He worked very very hard, but he wasn't rewarded financially for it. But he continued.
Right.
And thank God for all of us that he did, right? Because some of the most
Exactly.
moving and spiritually satisfying music it comes from the pen of that composer.
Exactly.
So we should be grateful for those people who had determination. Getting back to the theme of determination, yes, determination is probably the most important aspect of all. There are people who are very talented, very, very talented and gifted, what one would call naturally gifted, but they don't have that in
Right.
them. They won't continue no matter what. And
Right.
so they stop.
Sure.
And then there are people who are less gifted, who maybe it takes them longer to learn something, but they have that determination. They will continue learning and they'll continue absorbing the influences that they're exposed to. And in the end, they become greater artists.
What is generally required and expected from your specific job title in a professional working environment?
As a classical pianist, more specifically, one would be required to give public concerts, namely recitals and oftentimes collaborative work, chamber music, trios, quartets, duos, and then to play with symphony orchestras. Um, I think I mentioned earlier that the scenario has changed quite a bit in the last few years. Like live music is becoming less important. Therefore, adapting to the new circumstances becomes necessary. I think transmitting the knowledge and the tradition, transmitting the works of the great composers, and making them understood to a new generation is part of being a classical musician. So the importance of master classes, of either public master classes or online master classes, of transmitting the knowledge that one has acquired, which doesn't only encompass one's personal trajectory, but also encompasses the cultural environment and knowledge necessary to be able to interpret a work.
Okay.
Knowing about the literature of the time, knowing about the painting, the painters who were oftentimes very close to the composers themselves, knowing about the aesthetic movements and the philosophical movements of the time, are all part and parcel of being an effective performer. So those can be transmitted through teaching or through online master classes or public master classes. And so that's part of being a classical performer, not only the act of performing.
Basically, sharing your knowledge with others, I'm assuming in master classes, maybe private students even.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's part of keeping a tradition alive. Now, of course, a tradition is dead unless it echoes with the performers of today and the audiences of today. And oftentimes, one has to enter into the world of the composer, and but not only that, but the cultural context of the time in order to understand what is being expressed. So it doesn't. A work never arose in a vacuum, and I strongly, personally believe that the universal element, which is so strong in this music, can speak to all of humanity at any time. So it's not time specific
Sure.
whatsoever. And it's a very important task we have to be able to make music understood and understandable, not only to the people we're teaching, but to the audiences we're relating to.
Every profession has specific occupational skills required to obtain work. For example, an architect must know geometry to be able to build a house. To this end, I'd like to get your opinions and perspectives on common job skills you feel are required for you as a professional musician or vocalist. Let's begin with sight reading or sight singing. Is this a necessary job skill for you as a musician or vocalist? And if so, how does it help you gain employment? Do sight reading or sight singing expectations change according to work environments? For example, how does sight singing or sight reading expectations change from a top 40 band to studio work? How about for other musicians or vocalists? Is this an important job skill for them?
I would say it is, well, particularly if a soloist wants to branch off into collaborative work, and I think that's extremely important. From a personal perspective, my collaborative work with singers has been very enlightening, and that requires sight reading skills, certainly. Sure. But one deepens as a musician when when one understands the operatic literature and the song literature, lieder or melodie, and it informs our own playing as soloists. So sight reading is of course a very important skill to have. Not all soloists were great sight readers. You know,
Right.
Joseph Hoffman back in the day, he was a very poor sight reader. It took him a long time to uh, decipher treble, bass, clef together, apparently. And but he had an amazing ear and retained anything that he ever learned. So, uh, personally, I think yes, it is. It is very important.
How important is having good timekeeping skills?
Rhythm is the most essential element in music, whether it be jazz or classical music. And of course, when I speak of rhythm, I don't mean the beat, right?
Sure.
Rhythm being a living, I would say, almost organism within the music itself. To play in rhythm, it's not the same as keeping a metronomic beat, and that's especially
Exactly.
important in the classical tradition, where so much of what we're playing is based on dance forms. But as one knows, when you dance, there's breathing and there's a lilt and there's a sense of direction.
Sure.
So rhythm includes rhythmic flexibility, rubato, and all of the minuscule rhythmic manipulations which make music expressive and as far away from the machine
Yeah.
as necessary.
Sure.
So yes, rhythmical control. Rhythm is probably the most important aspect of music, and it's interesting to note that in a master class, if there's anything that I find most efficient in oftentimes very gifted students, it's usually uh, rhythm in a
Sure.
larger sense. So whenever I work with them, it's oftentimes it's working on correcting rhythmical problems. So we shape the rhythm, we shape the phrases, we shape within many different forms, but oftentimes it's within dance forms which relate to the actual human dancing.
How important is good ear training? How has it helped you in a professional working situation? Perhaps to be able to hear your way through a piece of music you don't know? How did you develop your ear training?
Certainly, certainly, very important. I don't know to what extent formal, you know, formally approaching it or working on exercise, all of that is important. But I think just simply listening and becoming absorbed in music, ear
Okay.
training in that sense, in that respect. I know
Sure.
for a musician, it's very important to transcribe from recordings. I know many jazz musicians who've learned, who've trained their ear in that way,
That's
simply by
very,
listening and transcribing. And
very
classical
true.
musicians do the same, I think.
Classical composers, I would imagine, probably do a lot of transcribing as well. Would you say that's the case?
Yes, yes. Even in the past, I know Mozart used to transcribe whatever he heard. Sometimes
Hmm.
miraculously so. He would hear a piece which had not been published, and he would go home and write it down.
Did he have perfect pitch?
Oh yes,
He
yes.
did. Okay.
Interestingly, yes, we know that. And in fact, when he was a small child, he was with his father walking in the countryside, and he heard a pig uh, grunting, and he said, "Well, that's an E flat." So, yeah, he had a miraculous ear. But interestingly, he was not. The A was lower at that time. We know that. So what he was his perfect pitch when you heard an A, it was actually what we would call a G. Uh,
Okay.
pitch has lowered. So of course, in that sense, perfect pitch is also relative
Sure.
pitch. But I would rather call perfect pitch memory,
Right.
being able to memorize what we consider to be specific notes.
How important is having excellent technique?
Well, technique is extremely important, but technique in the sense of not being able necessarily to play all of the notes accurately and quickly, because that's technique on a very basic level. Technique in the sense of transcending the actual sound and being able to communicate something essential to an audience. And that's what technique should be for. That's what we should aspire to when we master technique. So there's a spiritual dimension to technique, which goes beyond the pure physical ability to execute notes. A performance is a failure even if we're able to play every note accurately, but aren't able to transmit anything emotionally or metaphorically to an audience.
Sure.
But a performance which is able to do that is a success. And one can be successful in that way even when physically one might be deficient. Some people can play more slowly a passage, not quite as accurately as another, but still be successful in being able to transmit the conception of the piece and the emotional content. So that's technique on the highest level, and that's what performers should be working towards attaining.
So would you say then that, if I'm understanding you correctly, the technique should be in service of transmitting the music?
And it should always be so.
Right.
There are performances, no perfect performances, which say nothing to an audience, and then in that respect, they're aesthetic failures. Although they're technically, I mean, from an objective point of view, perhaps you could say that they're technically perfect. On the other hand, there could be flawed performances, but which are successfully aesthetically because they are able to transmit the conception and the meaning of a piece. I compare it to writers. Not every writer had the largest vocabulary. You think of somebody like Kafka, who had a rather commonplace vocabulary, but he was able to transmit something aesthetically that nobody else could. And he used maybe those what one would consider to be flaws to be successful aesthetically and successful artistically. We as musicians can do the same thing. We may have I think of the guitarist Django Reinhardt, who had a technical handicap because he couldn't use some of his fingers due to an accident. He was able to get around it because he had the conception and the will to transmit. So that's why I say transcendental technique, that which can even bypass the physical. We can use those elements that we have and also bypass the flaws in order to transmit musically what we're trying to communicate. That said, I do believe strongly in technical training. I'm one who I think we should even work on technique outside of the context of pieces, scales, arpeggios, all the technical. There's tremendous literature of composers and who wrote. Czerny comes to mind. Many exercises, which I think are sort of the foundation for what a pianist should aspire to, and one should spend a lot of time doing that.
Sure.
I'm just saying that should never be an end in itself.
Every style of music has standard repertoire, also known as standards in some genres. How important is it to know these pieces, and how does it help you earn money?
I think one should have a very thorough knowledge of the standard repertoire, but that doesn't mean that one has to play every single Beethoven sonata and perform it. I think as with technique, one should emphasize one's strengths, and perhaps not everybody is equipped to perform Chopin, but they feel more affinity towards Beethoven. I think one should have the knowledge, but not necessarily perform everything, or I don't even believe it's necessary to be able to perform every piece by every composer. One should aspire to that, yes, but as for a career, I don't think so.
Sure.
I don't think there's certain repertoire that certain people shouldn't be playing because either they don't understand it or they're not equipped emotionally to be able to play it.
Right.
maybe they feel more affinity towards other kinds of music.
Sure.
And I think it does a disservice to music to that people think of it as some kind of challenge, maybe even a challenge to their ego to be able to conquer any repertoire. I don't see much use for that.
Is versatility important? For example, knowing how to play or sing several different styles of music authentically? How is this beneficial, and does it help you make more money? Does being able to play more than one genre, does that create more opportunities for you?
I think it definitely does, and it also informs one as a musician. That I think one should never confine oneself to one particular genre, but be able uh, to approach others and also have that curiosity.
Yeah,
I even think that it's, for me personally, it's been very interesting to play some transcriptions, for example, some of Keith Jarrett's
sure,
transcriptions, and to record them. I mean, it informs me as a musician, and it's been very satisfying. So
sure,
having that kind of versatility, maybe even more so than ever before, uh, is very important.
sure.
One talks about crossover. I don't like too much of that term, but I do think that one should have a knowledge. A classical musician should have a knowledge of the great popular music as well, and the tradition of the American songbook.
Sure.
For example, I can't think that it would be inhibiting in any way, but only enriching.
Right.
Just
Exactly.
as jazz musicians should have some. I've spoken to some great jazz musicians. I think well, I could name names, but they some of them were very curious about Scriabin or Shostakovich, and
Hmm.
fascinated by, spent a lot of time listening to these composers. So, and I'm sure that it was only enriching to their own music making that they had that knowledge of these great 20th century composers.
Absolutely. And there's so much that's wonderful to explore. I mean, I'm really been getting into like Benjamin Britten, for example. I like his work. Samuel
Hmm.
Barber, phenomenal.
Yes.
I really, and you can really see how a lot of film composers actually have borrowed things, particularly like if you listen to, well, the first Star Wars, John Williams was borrowing, obviously
Yes.
from the planets, but
Yes.
yeah,
Right.
but then,
Known to have borrowed a lot from different many composers. Well,
oh
one of
yeah,
his influences was Korngold. If you listen
yeah,
to
Eric Horn, the King's Row. That's right.
if you listen to King's Row, right, the Star Wars theme is quite uh,
Yep.
discernible, and
And all.
uh, that's interesting. We mentioned Korngold because he's one of the composers I've recorded uh, in fairly recently, and I have a project after my Scriabin to record only uh, Korngold's piano music, which is
Nice.
somewhat neglected. So I would say Korngold was one of the creators of the Hollywood sound
Yeah.
back in the 30s, and a very important composer, operatic composer, and was quite well known in that field before he came and composed in Los Angeles.
Sure. Bernard Herrmann
So
too.
absolutely. Herman was quite well versed in the music, in Schoenberg's music, and you hear it. The anxiety and the unrest in the 12 tone
Yep.
or atonal music idiom is perfect for some of the scores. I come to mind. Psycho comes to mind, for
Sure.
example.
Of course.
It's an absolutely uh, perfect for that, for what he was trying to convey in
Sure.
that film. So
Jerry Goldsmith too, by the way. Jerry Goldsmith was very influenced by 12 Tone Row and Schoenberg, and
and there we have a direct connection with these composers to the classical tradition.
exactly.
Um, a few years back, I recorded a CD, which is called Exile or Exil, and it comprised five composers who were exiled from Europe during the Nazi period or fascist Italy period, and they came to Los Angeles. Some of
Wow.
them are well known and others less, and some of them composed for film,
Hmm.
but I think of, for example, Schoenberg. He didn't compose much for film. Korngold did, and he's on that CD. Another composer, Eric Zeisel,
Okay.
unknown but fascinating, deeply moving music. In fact, I had to take manuscripts, that's unpublished music, and work from manuscripts in order to play his very moving suite for piano called November. I gave the world premiere of that in that
Nice.
Exile recording. And Ernst Toch, who wrote, I think of one of the scores, which is beautiful. It's Peter Ibbotson, that film from the 30s. And he wrote the music for that. And Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco,
Sure.
the
He
only
taught
Italian, yeah,
he
on the disc.
he
And
taught John Williams.
that's right. He taught John Williams, and I believe Jerry Goldsmith and Andre
Yeah,
Previn.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So that we have a connection there between these exile composers from Europe who were forced to flee, and the transmission and the creation, I would even say, of the Hollywood film score during the golden period of
Mhm.
film scoring.
So, how important is it to be stylistically aware as a musician? And how do you go about doing that as a classical musician, particularly?
Yes, good question. Um, that's part of our work as interpreters, to be stylistically aware. Um, we're not going to perform a piece on the piano by Bach with pedal flooding the score, the music with pedal, or by doubling octaves as one might do in the 19th century. We know that that's not stylistic, not only because it doesn't match the style in which the music is written, but also we know that it wasn't practiced at the time. The pianos didn't have that capacity, or the music wasn't even written for piano. So in that sense, a certain stylistic awareness is extremely important. But one can go too far too. One can impose uh, certain amount of dogmatic, prescriptive playing on interpreters, which can be stifling, and in the end, it's not really capturing the authenticity of what the music itself contains. I give the example of a performance practice of Baroque music. A lot of what passes as authentic performance practice is uh, gleaned from 18th century textbooks or texts or treatises, and it's basically, a lot of it is presupposition or spurious um, rules imposed on performance, which we really actually don't know what was being done or how the music actually sounded at the time. It's just a sort of
Conjecture.
yes, conjecture. It's conjecture, and a lot of it we know is not historical, but it's become in some circles dogma. And for me, that's a bit of a pity. You
Yeah.
turn on the radio and you hear this generic kind of Baroque playing, very streamlined playing, very geometrical, I would say, very little rhythmical inflection or rubato, and that passes as being authentic. Well, we know it's not authentic. It reflects more 20th century notions of music making than it does whatever could have been done in the 18th century.
Sure.
Um, so I'm saying one can go too far in scholarship in that sense, where we're sort of losing the spirit of the music, or we're not making the music necessarily relevant or to us personally. We're imposing some sort of prescriptive performance practice on something which should in the end be much freer and much more creative.
What role does improvisation play for you as a musician or vocalist? What does that specifically entail, and do improvisation needs change according to the type of work you do? If you do improvise, what's your process, and do you have any tips for our audience on how to approach improvisation?
Right. So as a classical musician, I wouldn't necessarily go up and improvise. Maybe I'll dare to do that one day. But the spirit of improvisation is extremely important. When we play any music, we oftentimes want to create the music as if it were created at the moment we're playing it. It should sound as if it's fresh and it's coming somehow flowing from us spontaneously.
So
And I'd say
it should sound improvisatory then.
it can sound improper, and it should very often. I mean, if I'm playing a piece by Liszt, if so often music becomes rather stiff and uninspired because we lose that spirit of improvisation. If I'm performing a fantasy by Liszt and I'm playing it very in a streamlined manner and very rhythmically accurate and geometrical in conception and so on, I think we're completely losing the spirit of the piece.
Exactly.
So the use of rubato, the use of playing music in the sense of making it sound as if we're inventing it at the moment. That's one of the aspects of music making we should aspire to.
Would you say that's era based? It seems like during the Romantic era of music that there was a lot more liberty as far as rhythmic interpretation. Now, I could be totally wrong about this, but it seems like during the Baroque era, it was a little more. Not that it was completely rigid, but it's a little more metrically rigid than the Romantic era. Would you say that's true?
I say you're right in that way, and also one could say the same for the classical era,
Right.
Mozart and Haydn. That the music was based on rhythmic forms, dance forms. If you look at any suite by Bach, French suites, English suites, partitas, dance movements, music that could at least metaphorically be danced to. So we need a certain firmness or regularity of rhythm, which recalls the dance. So if we do anything we want rhythmically, then we actually lose the character of the piece.
Sure.
And then, of course, when we're talking about strict forms such as the fugue, if we distort the rhythm and speed up and slow down everywhere, then the integrity of the subject in the fugue will be somehow distorted,
Right.
and the counterpoint will be less clear. That said, there's a lot of Baroque music, and think of Bach's Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue, where the improvisatory quality, rhythmic freedom is extremely prevalent. And that doesn't mean that we should play metronomically Bach, because there are breathing spaces and there are inflections and expressive inflections which need to be integrated into our conception when we interpret this music. Same goes for Mozart. But I would say that music such as Liszt, you mentioned Liszt, where the clearly there is an improvisatory quality, and a lot of it is based on what he called Hungarian music, which is actually gypsy music, which was improvised music, right? Then clearly, if we want to be effective in the interpretation, we have to have rhythmic inflection and rhythmic flexibility as part of the conception.
Okay.
Think of slowing down and speeding up, and sometimes even in the extreme, right? Debussy's music requires the same, oftentimes, of rhythmic flexibility. Chopin certainly, famous rubato of Chopin. If you ever put a metronome to a Chopin nocturne, try to play along metronomically to any Chopin nocturne, and it sounds terrible. It doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah,
it doesn't make sense at all. So the rhythmic flexibility is composed into the piece.
correct.
The piece requires it.
Right. Yeah.
Then in the music of Bach, yes, you can play metronomically. It may not be the ideal performance. In fact, sure. I think it doesn't do service to music, because we do need some kind of rhythmic inflection,
sure.
flexibility. But I think that it can take it more than a you could say of a Chopin nocturne.
Now, along the lines of improvisation, have you played in Baroque ensembles, and how are you at realizing basso continuo?
I don't think it's expected to be able to create on the spot from a basso continuo in Baroque ensemble. A lot of people can, and that's wonderful. It's obvious. It's clearly a skill that one should study, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's necessary in performance to be able to master that skill.
Okay.
One can plan out, just as you can plan out an improvisation, or at least the improvisatory quality of an interpretation, without actually improvising on the spot.
That's an excellent point, actually.
It's just as effective.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes, actually, by Wynton Marsalis is improvisation means worked out. And I think that is really telling, because a lot of people think that when you improvise as a jazz musician, that you're just making stuff up in your head. And in a way you are. It's kind of like language, It's like you have certain phrases and you put the words together to make sentences, and the sentences make paragraphs, and paragraphs make chapters, and pretty soon you've got a book. But it all starts with this vocabulary that you string together in odd ways, and not odd ways, but different ways. And I think that's a very good point, as far as you can work it out ahead of time. And you may have 3 or 4 patterns for that 6/4 chord, let's say, and that's how you interpret it in different octaves,
Absolutely. And I think it is an individual approach that matters the most in that regard. If you look back at Art Tatum's improvisations, it does seem that much of what he was doing was worked out beforehand, which doesn't lessen in any way his greatness, right? As a musician. So I think some people are more spontaneously creating than others, but I think that it ultimately doesn't matter. What matters really is what we're transmitting.
What does professionalism mean to you? For example, attire, punctuality, etc.
That's an interesting question. I think that solid preparation is certainly very, very important. Technical mastery is to the best of our abilities, making sure that we master every single aspect of what we're going to play, memorize thoroughly. All of that's preliminary, that's preparation. On the other hand, professionalism can be a double-edged sword, because we sometimes want to be so professional that we in that respect that we lose spontaneity. So sometimes some of our best performances are when we feel we didn't expect to be asked to play, or we feel relaxed and we just go up and play, and then that's some of those, at least personally, those have been some of my best moments. Certainly, like in any other profession, to show up on time, to be able to work with others, to be pleasant, especially in a recording studio. Things will go better if there's respect and. But I mean, I can think of many examples of people who were not that way, and they seem to have worked well. Some conductors in the past were really not very pleasant people, and I don't think that's really acceptable today. But music making went on despite that. But I think yes. I mean, being punctuality, being able to be reliable. That's very important in this day and age.
Have you personally witnessed any situations where somebody lacked in these areas and it affected their employment?
Yes. Oh, yes.
We don't need to name names. I'm just
people don't want to work with them. They don't want to hire them again.
Right.
Especially in collaborative endeavors.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the colleagues don't want to work with somebody who's going to be difficult to the point of, I mean, having one's conception and strongly adhering to it and communicating that's one thing. But putting obstacles in the way of of working together and being able to come to an agreement, that's another. And I know many colleagues who refuse to work with certain people.
Do you do a lot of self-promotion to obtain work? How much time do you spend on it, and do you obtain most of your work through self-promotion, word-of-mouth referrals, or an equal amount of both?
Yes, I think that has become increasingly necessary for a musician. Now that we have YouTube, we have different platforms to be able to have our music better be known. It's becoming more and more necessary for the individual artist to take steps on their own.
So we all wear more hats.
We all have to
Yeah.
a certain degree if we want our music to be heard. Music has changed in that way. The business aspect of music, and it's always changing.
Do you have multiple income streams from music, and if so, what are they?
I mentioned recording. Yes, you get paid for recordings, but the main thing is live concerts. So those pay. Not since the lockdown, though. So that stopped for at least a year. That's one income. That's one part of the thread of income, as you mentioned. The other is master classes, whether online or live. So transmitting to students and also private students.
Right.
Who want to prepare for competitions or who want to have advice and interpretation. That's another aspect of being a musician. And I know very few performers who don't transmit their knowledge through teaching.
What specifically impresses you, and what are your specific main complaints about vocalists or musicians on your same instruments or as well on different instruments?
If you're playing cello music or collaborative music and somebody doesn't know their part,
Sure.
that's very, very irritating. But I think in general, what bothers me overall is a certain conformity in interpretation, certain expectations that we have to conform to a particular way of approaching or playing music in order to be accepted.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of pressure for that. Pressure as a result of competitions and as a result of what one imagines the audience will want to hear. So if you compare singers, just to take, for example, singers from the past with those of today, I happen to believe that overall there's been a decline.
Interesting.
Decline not only technically, but also artistically.
Yeah.
In terms of personality. You can, and I think the same thing goes for pianists as well.
How important is it to work on your weak areas as opposed to things you are comfortable with?
Well, I think that personally, it's a big challenge to be able to improve on those areas that don't come as naturally. And I think that's part of being an artist and part of being curious to overcome difficulties. And I think I mentioned earlier in the interview that oftentimes we can start with maybe fewer abilities, but through persistence and the will and having a vision in mind as an artist, we can actually surpass those who had maybe who were more naturally gifted in a certain domain.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's extremely important that we work on those weaknesses.
How do you develop an original sound?
I think if we start with the presupposition that we have to be original, then we're not being very successful in that task, because originality comes out of something that is entirely us as a person, as a human being. So everything we do should inform our unique sound, as you say. Everything we read, everything we think, everything we do, everything we are, our approach to life in general is reflected in the way we're going to sound as a musician.
Okay.
So I'd say cultivate those areas outside of music.
Right.
To aspiring musicians, pursue our passions and our our areas of interest to the utmost.
Okay.
Never cut off curiosity. Some of the greatest musicians were tremendous readers. I know Rachmaninoff had a unique sound, and he was very versed in Russian and other literature, world literature. And as I mentioned, Scriabin, being a great pianist as well as great composer, he was intensely interested in philosophy, and as it goes, mysticism as well. But that all completely informed his sound, his approach to color, his approach to spontaneity, his approach to rhythm. So all of that is definitely something that we can't just artificially impose. We can't just decide at one moment we want this or that sound and we're going to do it. It has to come naturally and authentically as a reflection of everything we are as a person, as a musician.
Would you say it's important for other musicians to learn the piano as a pianist?
I think it is important. Singers should learn how to play the piano. Many violinists, great violinists, were excellent pianists. Heifetz comes to mind, and Chrysler.
Mm-hmm.
They spent a lot of time practicing the piano and playing the repertoire. I think it's important because it gives a musician who's playing a melodic instrument or a singer to understand harmony and to understand not only the function of harmony, but the emotional power of harmony. And one of the ways is being able to actually play those harmonies on an instrument such as the piano.
Right.
So yes. I mean, if a violinist doesn't understand that, in when they're actually playing a sonata with a pianist and they don't understand the expressive power of harmony, then it will shape the way they approach the music. And they may not understand when they have to take time here and there, or when they have to play with a particular color or expression within a piece. So harmony is basically the foundation, everything, and learning piano is part of that understanding.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that. The emotional, let me see if I got it right, the emotional power of harmony. And I think a lot of people kind of miss that. It's just like chords and chords. Every chord has a certain feel to it, and all the harmony that you have has an intention of conveying emotion.
Absolutely. And the harmony structures the music as well. So even structure falls by the wayside if we don't understand that emotional power of harmony. And those events which need to be emphasized or need to be lingered on or need to be given a specific color because of their specific character within a context.
Exactly.
I think it's akin to riding on a train and looking out the window and just letting everything pass by you and not ever lingering and taking the time to notice the details. And so many interpretations remind me of that way of traveling quickly and just passing over quickly without really emphasizing what's most important. So
that's a great analogy.
Yeah, music loses its power if we don't think of it in that way.
That actually leads me to my next question, which is how important is understanding musical structures and music theory to you?
It is very important, but I would say that one can understand music. We were just talking about the expressive power of harmony. One can experience music and understand it, and understand why it is that when a dominant resolves to the tonic, or understanding why a C minor chord in this context of Debussy's piece for piano Image, why that stands out as an extremely powerful emotional event, even though it's only a C minor chord, because it's in the context of something else.
Right.
Understanding all of those aspects can be done without understanding the actual theory of
Sure.
of music. So if we understand it, we understand it on another level, an emotional, sensual level, which is the most important side to understand before we understand how we label it and how it's categorized. So one can understand the intellectual aspect of theory without understanding on the most important level, which is the emotional, coloristic, uh, sensual level. So yes, understanding the function, but function only as it regards the artistic context, right? And why that's important. Why is it important that we a lot of theory came retroactively. We analyze music
That's
after the
excellent.
fact.
Yes, that's true.
So I would say yes, of course, understanding theory, understanding function, but we can't use theory as a way of as a substitute for understanding music on the most important level, which is emotionally.
In your opinion, what are your favorite must have albums, individual tracks, or music related books to own that have influenced you, should be mandatory to own regarding work related education, or are considered historically important that you can recommend to our viewers?
There are so many. I would have to send you a list, maybe. But if I think my current readings, I'm reading the notebooks of Scriabin. If you're in a Scriabin interpreter, his writings, his
Okay.
notes. This is fascinating.
Hmm.
The writings of individual composers are very, very important. Beethoven's writings, his
Sure.
reflections, the letters, Debussy's letters are fascinating. I've been reading those as well. Um, I would recommend one book on the aesthetics of music.
Hmm.
I think it's probably the greatest book written on that subject, the aesthetics of music in this century. Roger Scruton's The Aesthetics of Music,
Okay.
back in the 1990s. He died recently, but he was a philosopher and a musician. And for me, it's the deepest analysis and understanding of music and its aesthetic import that has been written. On piano playing by Neuhaus, the great Russian pedagogue. That's important for pianists. As for recordings, I have favorite recordings as well.
Such
It's
as?
like, well, I love to listen to the early recordings of people as just concerning piano, right?
Sure.
Rachmaninoff's recordings are always fascinating, of his own music and that of others.
Sure.
His piano concertos. Uh, it's an approach to playing which is largely disappeared, but we can constantly enrich ourselves from his example. Great recordings, more modern recordings of Scriabin's poem of Ecstasy by Abbado. That's that's just fascinating. The Well-Tempered Clavier. Now this is going to be
Bach.
controversial. This is going to be controversial because we're used to Glenn Gould's recording, which
Hmm.
are interesting in themselves. But
Sure.
go back to uh, go back to uh, recordings from the early part of the century. I'm thinking of Samuel Feinberg, and some would say the approach is romantic, but uh, it's perfection in many other ways. I mean, the
Hmm.
difficulty that he was able to characterize every single prelude and every single fugue. Every key has its own personality, its own character.
Nice.
It's an extremely satisfying aesthetic experience to hear Bach under the hands of somebody like Feinberg. He brings
Nice.
out the humanity of Bach and the deeply religious character of the music. And we realize, in a sense, that these labels such as romantic, baroque, and
Right.
classic don't really have much meaning
No.
in because we realize that Bach, in aspiring to something beyond the notes themselves, beyond the purely formal aspect of his music, was also a romantic, right? But in a different way. So,
Absolutely.
so all these categories lose their meaning when we hear interpretations at that level. Ivo Pogorelic,
Okay.
Croatian pianist. There's a recording, a live recording of Scriabin's Fourth Sonata
All right.
from the 90s. It's a live recording, and in many ways, it's certain aspects aren't perfect in the sense that there's a pianissimo lightness that this music requires, which he doesn't bring out. But for the sheer visceral energy and the Promethean quality of extreme daring and virtuosity on the highest level, it's a very compelling recording. I recommend listening to that.
Okay.
Fourth Sonata. And then also Horowitz's Fifth Sonata, also a live recording, Scriabin Fifth Sonata.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah. So that, and I'm going to try. I'm recording those same pieces, and I'm preparing that. So I want to see if I can do better. We'll see.
What question didn't I ask that you think I should have? Are there any other perspectives you'd like to share not already covered on any other subject that you think are relevant to work skills?
I think we've covered quite a bit. Probably once we finish this interview, I'm going to think should have thought of that. But
any funny stories that you can share that happen while touring or in the studio? Something that people might find amusing? Kind of putting you on the spot here. I don't think that was on the list, was it?
No, I don't mind it at all. I mean, there are many situations, anecdotes. Gosh, I have to think, rack my brain for. But well, I mean, touring. Maybe I was touring with a cellist, and I remember we were. Our train was delayed, so we got to the place where we were going to play the next morning quite early, and there was no hotel available in the area, or we only found one. This was in Germany, and so we had to actually share a room, and so we did. But so he had a snoring issue, and the concert was the next day, and he snored loudly the whole night, and even despite my entreaties, he couldn't hear me, or I don't know what it was, but so the next morning, I asked him how he was doing. He asked me how I slept and so on, and he said I slept incredibly well, and but I think I heard you snoring at one point. He said to me. There I was, kept up all night.
So your website, how do people get in touch with you?
Well, my new website is under construction right now. I pulled down the old one, so it's a work in progress. It should be not long before it's up again.
Okay.
So I will definitely give you the address to that, and then they will be able to contact me on that. And then there are also, of course, YouTube videos and Wikipedia and many press articles you can find online. But all that will be somewhat put together on the website, so for easy access.
Okay.
All that should come soon.
Excellent. Well, we're looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Eric, thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this. And
same for me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hopefully it won't be too long before I see you in person with this lockdown and everything.
I hope so too. I miss those music making. I know we played together a few times. All right.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.